The initial process started with deciding which dataset to collect over the week term. I ultimately chose a personal communication and location dataset. With this dataset in mind, some options that were mentioned during the class brainstorming session, which was of particular interest, was the possibility of tracking cell phone tower bounces between phone communications. Although some websites track general info, unfortunately I was unable to find one with precise tracking. I then decided to track a few categories of phone communications, including text message, phone calls, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, and email. From there, I broke that information down into who the person I was communicating with, the date of the communication, their location, which was determined by location settings, location tags, and simply asking, the conversation type, whether it was happy, sad, etc., and finally the length of each communication. Some days involved more of one type of communication than others, as well as frequency of each. With consulting with Leanne, she had mentioned one interesting dataset to possibly include, which would be distance of these communications. As I already had collected the data for the location of these communications, it was a matter of reverse lookup for emails and distance calculations for each. Next was sketching and conceptualizing on how to best represent and visualize this dataset. Although mapping was my first and obvious choice, conceptualizing different ways to represent this dataset was crucial. This involved sketches of different styles of graphs, lines, and color schemes. Upon settling with the final design choice, which was a linear radial graph, there were a few variations sketched, looking again at line, shape, and length. One aspect of great importance for me to consider was a well-selected color scheme. Having similar colors would provide a nice analogous color scheme, however could prove difficult to distinguish between certain data points. Once deciding on a color scheme, going about the actual creation of the project began. Finding the center allowed me to find my starting point. A slow and steady process ensured my work would remain clean and consistent throughout the entire process. Once the entire graph was sketched out, I began the coloring process. It was important for me to focus on data above all else, thus the decision to color my type in a neutral gray. I felt an unobtrusive legend was needed to help distinguish information. Ultimately, I really enjoyed this project as the data collection was interesting, and the challenge of hand drawing it definitely gives you more insight into the data and what it represents.